I'd like to thank Hutchinsons very much for this invitation to speak to you today, and also for the timing of this conference. As a Welsh Rugby Union supporter, I'd much rather come and speak at a conference in England before Wales play England at Twickenham rather than after. But sad Welsh rugby fan that I am, I'm ever hopeful. Alternative views are not acceptable. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to unpack some of the myths, I hope, around this net zero thing, but do that at a really high level. You'll have seen from the agenda that everybody else is going to talk about what this might look like on farm. So I'm going to try and answer the question, what is it? Unpick our own net zero goal. And importantly, think about what needs to happen at the high level to help us get there. And then think about agriculture in context of what's happening in other economic sectors in this country and across the world. And that global perspective, I think, is particularly important, as Gary mentioned, because the UK hosted the 26th United Nations Climate Summit in November last year. So I'm going to start on the global stage, but I'm going to take you back 6-7 years to the United Nations Summit in Paris, where 190 countries signed the Paris Agreement and committed to do a range of different things. Importantly, they all committed to keeping global temperature rise well below 2 degrees centigrade, but really aim for 1.5 degrees. And that's particularly important for a sector like ours, which is so exposed to the weather. It talked about achieving this by getting that balance between greenhouse gas sources and greenhouse gas sinks. And you can already see how this Paris Agreement falls into agriculture's hands, as Gary said, really positioning agriculture as part of the solution. And the Paris Agreement also put power in the hands of governments. Previous agreements on climate change had been very much top-down, but this time governments were asked to put their own plans in place. They have to prepare, act on, and report on their plans. And those plans have to be more ambitious with time. And these aren't only plans to tackle greenhouse gases, but also plans around preparing for the impacts of climate change and on financing this transition. So for someone working on climate policy and for an organisation like the NFU, this is the stuff that really gets you thinking a lot. It set a clear direction of travel, and it does make you think, what's our response? What do we do? Do we wait? Do we wait for governments to set the agenda? Or are we going to be brave? And we did some work behind the scenes after 2015, and that gave Minette the courage in 2019 to set our own net zero target for UK agriculture to reach net zero by 2040. And part of the rationale is up here. It is about that balance, and it is about that bottom-up approach. If governments can set their own plans, why can't industry and sectors? So, what does it look like? That net bit, and the words in the Paris Agreement give it away. This is about balance. This is about balancing emissions by both reducing those emissions and by taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And our industry is unique. It often, I think, feels like everybody's pointing the finger at our industry. But the world can't deliver on its ambitions without our sector playing an important part. But our emissions are biological, so our uniqueness is is related to that biology, that we are very different from most of the other sectors of the economy whose emissions are related to carbon dioxide. It enables us to store carbon out of to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and we can do that naturally. But it also needs people in the landscape to maximize that carbon storage. People like you in this audience to make the most of that potential. But that biology also means that our emissions and those sinks are both harder to manage and to measure, and I'm sure we'll hear much more about that over this conference. But there is a recognition, and it's pretty universal, this isn't just the NFU saying it, that agriculture can't get its emissions to zero. So again, that net piece fits here. I did want to clear up, because I've heard different interpretations through time, that this is very much a national goal. This is not an expectation that every farm business gets to net zero. So unpicking this goal a little, what does it look like? So reaching net zero for us means actions across 3 pillars. The first pillar is about reducing our emissions. We're a responsible industry like every other, and everyone should be aiming to reduce emissions first. And so for us, that's being as efficient as we can in all those resources on farm that give rise to greenhouse gases, whether it's energy, nutrients, or managing soil for productivity. The other 2 pillars are making that most of our opportunity to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it. And this isn't a temporary store. We have to take out carbon dioxide and store it for as long as possible. And pillar 2 is about making the most of those opportunities on farmland. So storing that carbon in soils or in woody vegetation, hedges and trees. And the third pillar is about part of it is about what we can do for ourselves around the energy piece, but it's much more about agriculture's contribution to the rest of the economy, producing things from biology that the rest of the economy needs to substitute things made by or from fossil fuels. So in particular, bioenergy linked to carbon capture and storage, but also other things that the economy needs, whether it's biofuels, oils, insulation, fibre, all these things can be produced on farm. And we'd like to see farmers getting credit for that. So the million-dollar question is, can we get there? And this is some analysis we did back in 2018, before Minette made the announcement. And our analysis, based on work done by others, in particular the government's own independent advisors, they've just changed their names, the Climate Change Committee and the Royal Society, shows that we can get there. We can balance emissions from agricultural production, which is the bar in red and orange, with activity across those 3 pillars. And pillar 1, that bit on reducing emissions, delivering about 1/4 of our goal, storing carbon on farmland another 1/4, and that pillar 3, the remainder. So some really important things to say at this stage. Firstly, that this is what we knew then. Science and information always develops. And we were pretty sure then, and I continue to be convinced, that with time, the balance between those 3 pillars will change. But this gave us confidence that, in theory, we could get there. So, the other things that are important, I think I'm going to say this again, even though I only said it 2 minutes ago. This is not an expectation for every farm to get to net zero. Some might get there, it'll be more difficult for others. There are no silver bullets. We don't have a simple substitution like renewable energy for fossil fuel. And I think that far too often in our sector, people are looking for simple solutions, but this is complicated. So no silver bullets, not compromising domestic food production. As we've seen in other sectors of the economy, it's really easy to export production and emissions overseas, and we should not be doing that in this case, particularly in a world where climate is changing. And that piece around not compromising domestic production fits very well with the goals of the Paris Agreement. One of the Paris Agreement's purposes is to foster low greenhouse gas development in a way that doesn't threaten food production. So again, we think our goal fits those global ambitions. And one thing is clear, and I'm sure you'll hear this over the rest of the conference, is that there is no one size fits all, and this won't surprise any of you. Every field is different, every farm is different, every farmer is in a different position and is starting at a different point. And I often like to think about this as a jigsaw. I love pictures rather than words. And what that jigsaw looks like for your individual business will be different from someone else's jigsaw. I won't talk too much about this because I'm sure other speakers will pick this up. But we need to both reduce total emissions and emissions per tonne of product, which are things that the supply chain is particularly interested in. And I know this is an arable and horticulture sector conference, but I think as farms and as sectors think about their contribution to meeting this challenge, I think it's important that we think about what sectors can do for each other. So livestock and arable and horticulture farmers, thinking about those synergies on perhaps bringing livestock back to arable rotations, as I know some are thinking about, or how we can use organic manures, perhaps substitute for some of the inorganic fertilizer that people are using on farm, if that fits your business model. And also, what can you do for those sectors? So I deliberately kept that stat up there around the greenhouse gas footprint of poultry production. 60 to 80% of chicken production, the greenhouse gas footprint of chicken is in feed, and a lot of that comes from soya, is associated with soya. So what can you do as a sector to help the poultry sector reduce its emissions? However, we've been clear all along that we can't do this on our own. Farmers can't do this on our own. So it's really great to see a company like Hutchinsons grabbing this agenda by the scruff of the neck. And everybody else has a part to play. And whether it's research, policy, the supply chain, and really great to see some representatives here tackling some of those areas. So if you think about research, there are things that we know that we can do now. The challenge is to try and get as many farmers doing as many of those things as possible, so we can max out on that Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 opportunities. But we also need research, scientists, technology developers to start thinking now about the practical solutions that farmers are going to need in 5, 10, 15 years' time. So that's my challenge to Steve when he comes on the platform. And not only thinking about those practical solutions, but how we're going to find easy and simple solutions of monitoring, measuring and monitoring progress. Second up is policy. And this this is a long-term commitment that the industry's made, that every company and government setting a net zero goal is making. And so policy has to be consistent, has to be stable, and it definitely has to be coherent. So businesses have the confidence to invest for the long term, that this is the direction of travel. And it's really important that government departments are aligned when they're setting their policy for the different regions, for the different areas of competency, that they're not operating in isolation. And when you think about the huge transition that our sector is going through at the moment, that it's, at least to me from a climate change perspective, it's never felt like a better time to really take this subject seriously. And so ELMS is really important for lots of different reasons. But for those of you, I'm sure many of you will know the ELMS in its entirety much better than me. But from a net zero perspective, it still feels like there's a real gap. Where is the concerted government effort to really match our ambition? But this isn't just about ELMS, and it isn't just about DEFRA, because you need much more than what comes out of the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. That cross-government policy is really important. And so this means we need infrastructure in place, it needs planning, perhaps Department of Health, and it importantly needs the Treasury, not only in funding DEFRA and its activities, but really encouraging businesses across the economy, giving them confidence to invest. And the government's own independent climate change advisors thinks that most of the funding for this net zero transition is going to come from the private sector. So government has a real role here in unlocking that investment. And so when you look at our sector, where might that funding come from? Because the sector's had years of underinvestment. And currently, there's a lot of interest in the voluntary carbon market. So the voluntary carbon market, it's a pretty broad church. And it's a process whereby somebody pays somebody else, in our case farmers, to take actions on their behalf that reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there's a compliance market that's been long in existence, that's operated at the European level, and that we've now transposed here to the UK. And I won't say too much about that, but I'm going to focus on the voluntary market and look at the opportunity and consider the opportunities. And perhaps I'd be interested to hear what you think. Is this a real thing for us? Or is it some hot air? And there may be opportunities here for companies to pay farmers to both reduce emissions, but also store carbon. But the market is at a really early stage. It may not feel like it. If you read papers, talk to colleagues, it feels to us that this is one of the questions on the forefront of everybody's minds. But you can see, particularly in the sort of policy vacuum that we find ourselves in with ELMS, certainty around ELMS still a few years away, you can see why some have been and are being tempted. But I guess I would ask, there are lots of questions that we would recommend that you would ask yourself. Do you have your own net zero goal? What is your supply chain? Or what might your food and drink supply chain require of you? Who is it that you're dealing with? Who's the buyer? What commitments are you going to be asked to undertake? And the duration of that commitment, I think, is really important, particularly when it comes to carbon storage. I said earlier, this carbon needs to be taken out of the atmosphere for a long time. So I think all these things you would need to consider if you think that this is an option for you and your business and an important piece of your particular jigsaw. And then the final thing to say, and it's really good to see Nigel from Muntons here, is that the supply chain also has a role here. We have to work together to solve this, because there's work that can be done on farm, but there's also things that supply chain, both pre-farm gate and post-farm gate, can do to either support farmers or change what they do to make what I think is the trickiest bit to manage, managing on-farm emissions to tackle the greenhouse gas footprint of food products. So this is our goal. There's lots happening in other sectors of the economy, governments setting their own net zero goals. And it was really great for a climate change geek to see the United Nations Climate Summit coming to this country. And I've heard the Cop26 president, Alex Sharma, give the conference 6 out of 10 for what it achieved. And that's a pretty fair reflection. Government asked companies and countries to come to this conference with greater ambition, with more ambitious plans to reach net zero, which is why you've seen this agenda ramping up. And there were some significant announcements as the result of this. So commitments to halt deforestation, which have important implications for those commodities in our supply chain like soya and palm oil. It sounded the death knell for coal. It mentioned, an official United Nations document mentioned reducing fossil fuels for the very first time. There's a global methane pledge, which is a global target to reduce methane emissions by 30%. It's clearly targeted at the oil and gas sector, but the two governments who launched the initiative, US and EU, talked really positively about supporting their farmers to reduce methane emissions, and we hope that our government would take a similar approach. So, although agriculture wasn't a priority and much on the official agenda at this conference, really proud that farmers came out in force, because it's really important that our voice is heard on this national stage. Otherwise, we'll get other people speaking for us. And this really set the groundwork. I think looking forward to Cop27 in Egypt, it's an African COP. It's really hard to believe that agriculture and food security won't be a priority for that government and for that continent. So this feels like a perfect time to have this conference, to set out what it is farmers can do and what they need. Thank you very much.